Well, thank you very much, Erica, for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much, all of you, for welcoming back here to the Silicon Valley, to, I guess, the biggest group therapy session in the Bay Area. Yeah, and so, yeah, as Erica mentioned, I started my career after law school, and I'm a recovering lawyer. So I started my career as a speechwriter, and you know, for those of you, thankfully, who remember Governor George Duke Majan, I always tell folks I was the guy who gave the Duke all that charisma. So you know, I was a speechwriter for Governor Duke Majan. I was a speechwriter for Ed Meese when he was Attorney General of the United States. And I also tell folks that behind every great man, there's a little Japanese guy at a keyboard. I'm glad to hear that from Joel that the bar is going to be open, because I always sound better after a couple drinks. So I hope all of you partake. I want to thank Erica for reaching out to me to invite me back here. I want to thank Joel and the Conservative Liberty Forum now of Silicon Valley for having me back. And I want to thank all the volunteers out there who are helping to staff this event. I know that you know, with a huge group like this, you know, it takes a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people to put these things together. And you know, I have great admiration for organizations like yours who provide this type of outlet for people who feel marginalized and isolated, especially in an area like the San Francisco/Bay Area. So thank you to this organization, to all of you who took the time out to come here. You know, I'm going to be talking about education, and I was very heartened on the way into the hall today when I ran into, Erica and I were walking in and ran into a young man here and his father who were coming here for the first time. And this young man is just starting high school, right? Junior in high school, right? Okay. And anyway, so this is his first time here, and he's coming here in order to, you know, get ideas, you know, to get some bolstering for, you know, being in a public school for the first time. You were in private school, I think you mentioned to me. So, and that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, was what is that experience like in public schools nowadays? You know, I've written this book called The Corrupt Classroom, and the subtitle is Bias, Indoctrination, Violence, and Social Engineering Show Why America Needs School Choice. And let me give you a little bit of background on me and my research. I've been with the Pacific Research Institute, which is a free market think tank based in San Francisco, but we also have offices in Sacramento, where I'm based, and also down in Pasadena. And we're the leading free market think tank in the state, focusing on California issues and also on national issues as well. You've had Sally Pipes, our president and CEO, here talking about healthcare, which is her big issue. But I am the senior director of our Center for Education and the Corrett Senior Fellow in Education Studies at Pacific Research. I've been with PRI for the past 20 plus years. I can't believe that. But you know, in a lot of my time researching education in California, I've really focused a lot on academic issues, right? Like test scores, how well schools are doing, you know. I mean, some of you may, in fact, some of you have come up to me before the event started and actually talked to me about some of my previous work. I wrote a book called Not As Good As You Think, which looked at the underperformance of middle class and more affluent schools here in California. A lot of people think that, well, the only poor performance that we're experiencing in our schools here are from those schools that are populated mostly by kids from low-income backgrounds, and that's certainly not the case. You know, for example, here in California, just most recently on the national exam that most states administer, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, if you look not at California students as a whole, but just at those students who are classified as not from poor or low-income backgrounds, the non-poor students, let's say on 8th grade mathematics, you find that 55% of non-poor students fail to perform at the proficient level in mathematics. And it was even worse in reading. For non-poor students on the 8th grade reading exam, 57%, nearly 6 out of 10 non-poor students in California failed to perform at the proficient level on reading. And so there's lots of academic underperformance going on in your own backyards, basically. When I wrote that book, more than 10 years ago, called Not As Good As You Think, a number of the schools that I featured were schools here in the Silicon Valley. And I'm sure that things actually have not changed since that time. But the thing of it is, and the reason why I wrote this book called The Corrupt Classroom, is that parents make decisions about where they want to send their child, not just on test scores and how kids are doing in math or English or some of the other academic subjects. There are lots of other reasons why parents may be dissatisfied with the education that their children are receiving, right? And so what are some of those things? Well, some of those things are what make up the chapters in my book. So, for example, let's take the issue that a lot of you are interested in, politics, right? All of us are interested in politics. And, we've often talked about liberal bias in, society as a whole, and certainly in America, in American culture, but it's certainly the case that there's a liberal bias in the classroom. And it's not just on college campuses. You see a lot of news, about a professor, lecturing about, something that is just absolutely offensive to anybody who has, let's say, the points of view of all of you. But it's a lot of it is down in the K-12 level as well. And so, for example, I have a whole list of examples in the book. Take, for example, the anti-Trump protests that were occurring here in the Bay Area, in Berkeley, in San Francisco, and other Northern California cities like Sacramento, where I'm from. And who's the leader of these protests? Well, one of the key leaders of the protests is a woman named Yvette Falarka. And some of you may recognize her name. She was actually on Tucker Carlson's show last year, I believe. Anyway, she's actually a middle school teacher at Martin Luther King Public Middle School in Berkeley. And she's also one of the key leaders of the radical organization, By Any Means Necessary. And she's been in the forefront of these violent and destructive anti-Trump protests that have been occurring. In fact, she allegedly physically assaulted a man at an anti-Trump rally in Sacramento in 2016, and that started a huge melee that ended up with numerous people stabbed. Now, eventually, after going through a lot of videotape of that event, the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office ended up charging her with various criminal charges based upon her involvement with this violent demonstration. But Falarka says that the First Amendment, and this is one of her excuses when people ask her about, her activities, that the First Amendment should not protect the speech with which she disagrees, and that she labels hate speech. But, if you think about that, she's involved in violent activities. She has this totalitarian ideology that basically says that probably most of you should not have free speech rights because of what you believe in. What do parents think about that? Even for a liberal bastion like Berkeley, parents think that this is just beyond the pale. Like one Berkeley parent said that Falarka's violent, in-your-face message has no place in the classroom, especially at a school named after an activist, Martin Luther King, who preached for social change through nonviolence. All right? But it's not just in, someplace like Berkeley. Here in Mountain View, for example, a history teacher was suspended after he lectured students on the parallels between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. Yeah, both Trump and Hitler, this teacher supposedly said, wanted to make their countries great again. So, But, the thing of it is that, what I want to also make clear is that, this type of Trump derangement syndrome that really came to the fore, in 2016 during the presidential campaign, and certainly has continued, after Trump has been inaugurated as president of the United States, that this is not a phenomenon that is limited just to a place like the Bay Area or to California. It's all across the country, in blue states, red states, purple states. So, for example, in North Carolina, an English teacher made students compare speeches by Trump and Adolf Hitler. In a secret audio recording of one of her lessons by a student in her class, the teacher can be heard saying that the only people who are safe from Donald Trump are white Christian males. All right? One of the parents of one of the kids in that North Carolina school said that her son felt like this teacher was attacking anybody who liked Trump or anybody's parents who liked Trump. But another parent also said that most conservative parents in that area don't want to fight the system because they know they're going to be shouted down. Sound familiar? Right? Now, you thought that you were the only ones here in the Bay Area who had that feeling? It's like that across the country. And this is in a state, North Carolina, that went for Donald Trump. In Texas, a teacher did, another very red state. In Texas, a teacher did a fake assassination of President Trump in class using a squirt gun as she yelled, "Die, die, die," at the projected image. A Colorado teacher put President Trump's face on a piñata and asked students to take a whack at it, right? One of the parents in that class in Colorado said, "It's so disturbing that this would be happening in a school setting. Why divide people? Why do this?" Right? And very good questions. What is to be gained from, encouraging students in a class to take a whack at President Trump? In New Hampshire, a high school teacher dressed up as Donald Trump and danced to a profane anti-Trump rap song. A New Hampshire parent asked, "It's not even like this was a sociology teacher. This was a geometry teacher." I don't know what equations that person is doing, A New York teacher gives out a homework assignment with fill-in-the-blank, answers, right? So where the correct answers are to complete the sentences were ones that disparaged President Trump. A New York parent said, "I don't think that putting your personal feelings about politics into a sixth grader's homework paper is proper. There were at least 1,000 sentences that could have been used besides disparaging our president." Absolutely true, right? But it's more than individual teachers. Like, if you look at teachers' unions here in San Francisco, right? The San Francisco Teachers Union issued a lesson plan for all teachers in the district after President Trump's election that called Trump a racist and sexist man who had a huge racist and sexist base. So it wasn't them just attacking Trump, it was them attacking I assume all of you, but all of the people who voted for him as well. The lesson plan asked students to create a poster directed at Trump supporters who are described as dehumanizing students. All right? The lesson plan only included articles and reports and videos by left-wing sources and publications like producer-director Michael Moore. Yeah. So how are pro-Trump students supposed to feel when Trump is characterized by teachers as racist, sexist, and unjust? There's no acknowledgement of the chilling effect that such policies have on free speech in general, and specifically on the ability of students to make up their own minds about candidates and policies. A lot of you probably know Harmeet Dillon, who is a Republican activist in the Bay Area. She's actually the Republican National Committee woman from California, and she called this plan by the San Francisco Teachers Union an inappropriate propaganda that unfairly demonizes the campaign that Donald Trump, the winner, ran, but also the people who voted for him. All right? But there's more to political and ideological bias than individual teachers and teachers' unions who are talking about President Trump. All right? It goes much deeper than all of that. The curriculum itself is often intentionally biased and one-sided. If you look, for example, at California's History and Social Studies curriculum framework, which is supposed to guide the teaching and instruction in classrooms, it conspicuously fails to mention, for example, the monumental atrocities committed by communism in the 20th century. All right? So exactly how do they depict communist nations, such as the Soviet Union? Well, in the section on the Cold War, the curriculum framework only says that the Soviet Union had a poor record of protecting human rights. Is that it? Huh. You know, it never mentions the fact that the Soviet Union killed at least up to 20 million people during its existence. All right? And that I was being ultra conservative there, you know, but yes, wait till you hear another statistic I'm going to come up with in just a second. The framework also says that the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward in Communist China, you know, which were two of the biggest mass murder events in human history, caused what? Not genocide, but caused unrest and disorder. It does not mention that these two programs alone killed up to 46 million ordinary Chinese people. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the book is that if you look at what actually happened in countries like Communist China during these programs, you have like unbelievable things occurring, I mean, evil atrocities occurring, where, like, for example, the Great Leap Forward was the forced imposition of communist agricultural policies on the Chinese people, which resulted in the largest mass famine in human history. And it caused, in the countryside, parents to cannibalize their own children in order to survive, trade their children between families in order to cannibalize them in order to survive. I mean, just unbelievable, you know, things that make you wince just reading the words on the page. And yet, you know, we're told that, you know, this was a regime that simply caused unrest in the countryside. And not surprisingly, the framework fails to mention that as a whole, in the 20th century, communism is responsible for at least up to 100 million deaths. And yet, none of that makes it into the classroom in California. And what is the impact of this failure to transmit this basic information about, you know, one of the most, not only evil, but also one of the most important ideologies that ran governments throughout the world in the 20th century, is the fact that it whitewashes that experience, with the result that students here in California and elsewhere, you know, end up having no idea about the immensity of the evil that was communism. And so, for example, in polls of millennials, you find out that for those millennials who have heard of him, 1 in 4 have a favorable opinion of Vladimir Lenin. And even worse than that, more millennials believe that more people died under the administration of George W. Bush than under Joseph Stalin. So, you know, whatever one thinks about the Bush family, I mean, there's no concept of what Gene Kirkpatrick, the ambassador to the United Nations during Ronald Reagan's administration, you know, said about the Soviet Union and about communism, and also what Ronald Reagan, her boss, depicted communism as the evil empire, right? There's none of that comes through. And what is the future of people who have that viewpoint? Well, it turns out that only 25% of millennials, according to polling data, say that living in a democracy is essential, right? Now that should be scary, that only a quarter of millennials actually think that democracy is an essential for living in this country. But so, if we were to just stop at political bias, that would be shocking, and that would be enough to probably fill the entire book. But like they say on those TV commercials, but wait, there's more. So, you know, there's also things such as school safety, violence in the classroom. If you look at the latest federal statistics, it's absolutely shocking to see the amount of violence that is taking place across America's school campuses. According to these federal statistics, 65% of the public schools reported more than one incident of violence. That translates to more than 750,000 crimes committed on our public school campuses. And it's even worse in some grades. Nearly 9 in 10 public middle schools report that there have been crimes of violence committed on their campuses. But let's put some faces to these statistics, all right? One of the things I've tried to do in this book is to, not only talk about the data, is to tell the human story about, behind the data. So take, for example, this little 9-year-old girl named Lanny Turpin. Now, Lanny went to a public elementary school in Alabama, and she was unfortunately the victim of bullying and a physical assault. In fact, she was assaulted by another student, which caused her to receive a concussion. She was bleeding all over her face. She had contusions. She was in bad shape. The school calls her mom in to pick Lanny up. So the mom goes to the nurse's office, and the nurse then tells Lanny's mom that, when of course Lanny's mom asks, well, how did this happen? The nurse tells Lanny's mom that, she accidentally fell and hit her head. Now, Lanny, although she had a concussion and was bleeding, was able to pipe up and say, "No, Mama, I told them this other girl jumped me." So of course, Lanny's mom is then extremely upset by this information, and she goes to the principal and asks the principal, well, what is going to be done about the perpetrator of this crime? And the principal allegedly says that, we're going to suspend that student. Well, it turns out they never did, all right? So you have the school, it was bad enough that Lanny ended up receiving these severe physical injuries, but then the school tried to cover it up after that. And so Lanny's mom ends up taking her out of school and starts to homeschool her. But she's, in an interview with a newspaper in Alabama, said that many other parents have the same types of experience at this school, right? Hers made the newspaper, but there are all these others that didn't. And that's the important point, is that you might hear a terrible story like this, but it's not an isolated anomaly. These sorts of things are happening all across the country, in all states. I'll give you another example, and this is particularly bad. There's a little girl in South Carolina. She was an African-American girl at a public middle school, and she had been verbally and physically assaulted for 2 years for supposedly acting white. Now, her parents have sued the school district, all right? The girl was an honors student, but according to the lawsuit, was constantly taunted as an Oreo, a white girl, and a wannabe white girl. Students threw water in her face, beat her with a bottle, and slammed her face with a backpack that broke her teeth. She was stalked on campus, both in and out of the classroom, and things got so bad for this poor girl that she was forced to eat her lunches in a girls' restroom toilet stall to avoid her tormentors, right? Now, again, all of this is bad enough, but what's just as bad is that the school officials did nothing, right? The girl's parents reported the harassment to school officials, to district officials, and school board members, and they did little or nothing. And I should mention that the girl's father is a career U.S. Army soldier at a base in South Carolina. So here's this man who is putting his life on the line to protect all our liberties and protect the liberties of those school officials. And what does he get in return? He allows these kids in school to assault and torment his daughter, to the point where she's, she is in a very bad shape. That's the kind of payment that we give back to a soldier. After reading this story, and this lawsuit was filed just a few months ago. It reminded me of an episode anybody here watched that series on Netflix called The Crown? It's a really good series, right? Yeah. Anyway, it's a story about the royal family, about Queen Elizabeth, from when she gets, ascends to the throne in the early 1950s, through the rest of her life. But anyway, there's an episode in The Crown that focuses on Prince Charles when he's sent away by the royal family to a school in Scotland called Gordonston, and because that's where Prince Philip had gone to school. He had a terrible experience there, and according to the epilogue, he refers to his experience there as hell on earth. You can only imagine that that's probably what this girl in South Carolina felt about her time at this middle school, having to eat her lunches in a toilet stall in order to feel safe from her attackers. So, in the face of this surging crime epidemic, what's being done? Well, you'd think that we would be getting tough on the people who are committing these crimes. Unfortunately, it's the other direction. Under the Obama administration, the Education Department sent out a directive to schools saying that they should stop suspension policies that have a disparate impact on minority students, even if those policies were race neutral on its face. Thus, even if the suspension policy had no discriminatory intent, if more minorities were suspended, then that policy had to be eliminated. Okay? Yet, if you look at the research, and there's research that's been done by scholars at Florida State University, the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Texas at Dallas, that shows that student suspensions are best explained by previous student behavior, not by the race or the policies of that school. And so what has been the effect, though, of the policies that has been promoted by the Obama administration and adopted by so many school districts, these anti-suspension policies? What you find out is that discipline has broken down across the country. And so you find that large majorities of teachers in places like Santa Ana down in Southern California, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Denver, Colorado, Jackson, Mississippi, Syracuse, New York, you have teachers all saying that the anti-suspension policies that have been adopted by their districts have made their schools more violent to the point where they worry about their own safety. A parent in Minnesota said that when she complained that the school had not called the police when her child was viciously kicked in the groin, the principal shrugged and replied, "That's your job." So what is the impact of this chaos in our nation's schools? Well, research by the University of California at Davis, just up the highway here, I did my master's at UC Davis. Research by UC Davis and the University of Pittsburgh shows that leaving just one disruptive student in a classroom negatively impacts the learning, of all the rest of the class, right? Doesn't that sound like common sense? Right? Think back to your days in school. If there was a disruptive student in your class, what was the teacher doing? The teacher was focusing on that student and not teaching the rest of you, right? So those are precious minutes that are taken away from the learning process for the majority of the students and trying to calm down or do something about the disruptive student. But it's not just student-on-student crime. One of the things I talk about in the book is also teacher-on-student crime. We've all heard about, by now, Harvey Weinstein and all of the things that came out about him, right? Well, let me tell you about Mitchell Whitehurst, the Harvey Weinstein of public education. As the school year started in late summer 2017, an investigative reporter named Bethany Barnes of the Oregonian newspaper broke the story about this fellow, Mitchell Whitehurst, who is a Portland Public Schools physical education teacher, who had been the subject of sexual harassment complaints by young female students and adult women stretching over decades. And the complaints were just not the stray lewd comment, but shocking Weinstein-like sex demands. According to the Columbia Journalism Review, this reporter, Bethany Barnes, sifted through old records and found unbelievably shocking accounts. In 2008, a former student came forward and revealed that in the early 1980s, she and another female student were allegedly asked by Whitehurst to perform oral sex. Whitehurst allegedly took the girls to his apartment and said that he wanted to then see them kiss. This former student, it's almost like you can't make this up. This former student eventually becomes a substitute teacher and reported the incident again in 2013, but she found out that Whitehurst taught at the school at which she substituted. But Whitehurst continued to teach. Like Weinstein, Whitehurst allegedly preyed on those females who he put into power imbalance situations. In 2001, he made a high school student, Rose Soto, his student aide, but then, according to the reporter Barnes, spent the year making unrelenting sexual advances on Rose. For instance, Whitehurst allegedly talked about Rose's pants, saying, "You know why they're so great? Because of the zipper in the back. You just unzip them and boom, we're on it." Whitehurst also allegedly pulled up to Rose in his sports car as she waited at a bus stop and allegedly said, "You know, Rose, I really need a jazzy girl like you in my life. Why don't you get in?" Rose eventually mustered the courage to report him, giving a detailed first-hand account to the Portland School District. But there are no records that the lawyer who investigated the complaint ever bothered to talk to Rose. No one from the State Teacher Licensing Board ever contacted her, even though the complaint was referred to the agency. But the attorney for the school district did tell the licensing agency that Rose could be confused and that Whitehurst was still fit to teach. And Whitehurst went unpunished. By 2013, the reporter Barnes said that dozens of 8th grade girls boycotted Whitehurst classes, and according to interviews of those girls, they often hid in the bathroom to avoid him or wore shoes unfit for gym so they could sit out class. One student said, "Most girls are really scared and shaking when they enter PE." So what did the Portland Public Schools do about Whitehurst? Nothing. Just as Harvey Weinstein's sex predations were an open secret in Hollywood, one of Whitehurst's principals admitted for the past 30 years there have been rumblings about Coach Whitehurst and his over-friendliness with female students and staff. In fact, she even worried that "I'm extremely concerned about his conduct becoming a Penn State University scandal," referring to the Coach Sandusky, Joe Paterno debauchery and debacle. Yet, like Hollywood, the Portland Public Schools ignored the complaints of the victims, and according to Barnes, school and district officials would repeatedly protect Whitehurst and dismiss complaints from the girls. Further, records and interviews show that the system protected Whitehurst, not the children, that district officials, including the top lawyers, the 2 human resource directors, and at least 3 principals downplayed complaints from the students and staff as isolated instances, rumors, or misunderstandings. The teachers' union, has been silent on Whitehurst, right? Despite all of these botched investigations, the provisions in the teacher union contract in Portland actually protects Whitehurst from being revealed. Eventually, Whitehurst was forced to surrender his teaching license, but why? Not because of these complaints from all these women over all these many, many years, but because he acted inappropriately and mistreated a male colleague. But Whitehurst is far from an anomaly. In just the year of 2014 alone, a study came out showing that teachers and school staff reportedly committed nearly 800 sex crimes against students. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because remember that Whitehurst was protected for years by his school district and did not become part of any of those types of statistics, right? So how many of those sorts of things are occurring throughout our education system that are never reported, and yet those victims, like Rose Soto and others, never get their fair hearing? There's never a Me Too movement for them, like that's going on in Hollywood, right? No one's wearing black clothing to mark their suffering, like it was done by Hollywood at the Golden Globe Awards, right? And it's not as if school districts aren't aware that these kinds of things are occurring. I mean, in fact, Los Angeles and New York City both maintain so-called rubber rooms to hold teachers and other school staff who have committed various offenses. And they're basically paid to do nothing but sit in these rooms. And in both cities, the cost is about $15 million a year. Now, I have a whole chapter devoted to, and you think that's a waste of money. You'll read my chapter on the fiscal mismanagement of school districts. As I said, I have lots of examples. Take Los Angeles Unified School District, which is actually facing bankruptcy. Surprise, surprise. But why? Well, because of things such as, a couple years ago, LA Unified impaneled a group of their own experts, their hand-chosen experts, to go over their fiscal management practices. And this panel came back and said that if the district continued to adhere to their spending habits, that the district would face very dire financial future. And yet, despite this warning, within a few months of that recommendation from their own panel, what did the school board do? They negotiated a very expensive contract with the Service Employees International Union for part-time workers to give them full health care coverage. And unsurprisingly, this action was taken without any discussion at the school board. Now it's reported that LA Unified could face a budget shortfall of more than $400 million in 2019 alone. I mean, there are just so many other types of examples. Take a look at the book. But what all of this shows is who suffers. Who suffers from all this? Who suffers from the politics in the classroom? Who suffers from the lack of safety of the children who are entrusted to the schools? Who suffers from the fiscal mismanagement? In LA Unified, for example, one of the outcomes of all their fiscal mismanagement is the cutting back of services to kids in the classroom. The people who suffer are the children. They're the people for whom the system is supposedly established in the first place to serve, right? And yet they're the ones who are not prioritized in whether it's in investigating misbehavior, whether it's in deciding where scarce resources should be put, or in deciding, what is suitable instruction in the classroom. The kids are always a second priority. So the bottom line, that if parents and children are stuck in a politically biased public school, stuck in an unsafe school, or stuck in a fiscally mismanaged school, or stuck in a socially engineered school that undermines their values, then they need an exit tool so that they will have a choice in the school and the type of education that's provided to their children. And all these reasons have nothing to do directly, anyway, with test scores and academics. These are all about issues that involve, values, culture, all those things that, we hear on some of our favorite radio shows, right? And yet, that's what's happening in the classroom. And those are reason enough for parents to have that choice, and to be able to leave a school that is undermining them as parents, that's undermining their values, that's undermining their children's future as thinking adults. So whether the choice tool is a charter school or an education savings account, as Nevada and Arizona have implemented, a tax credit for private school tuition, or some other type of school choice mechanism, parents have to have the ability to access the type of education that best suits the needs of whom? Their own children. Your children are not wards of the state. Your children are your children, and you should have the liberty to be able to choose the type of education that best suits their needs. You shouldn't have some faceless bureaucrat at some district office or in some anonymous state agency in Sacramento or in Washington telling you about how to educate your child and how best to do that. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why I wrote this book. And I hope that, afterwards, you take advantage of all the stack of books there. And, we ask for a $10 donation for them. You can also get them, if you want to get them for your friends, The Corrupt Classroom is available on Amazon.com. And I will say that, our book has had a huge notice across the country. I was happy to be able to have a private meeting with Secretary Betsy DeVos to present her with a copy of the book. One of the things that I don't think Erica mentioned in her introduction of me is that I was very honored in 2016 to serve as a member of President Trump's Transition Agency Action Team on Education Policy. So I was one of 7 people in the country to serve on that team, and I'm pleased to say that the national headquarters viewed our team as one of the model teams in the transition. So, I think that all of you are such an important part of taking back our country. And, even in an area like the Bay Area, look at what happened with President Trump. No one thought he could have a chance, and here he is now President of the United States. So, I want to thank you all for your activism, for your dedication to the principles of freedom and liberty, and for your support of this organization and all the great speakers who you've brought here through the years and it will continue to bring to educate, all yourselves and your neighbors. So thank you very much.
It's been about a year, and would you say, has there been any change with Betsy DeVos at the helm of the Education Department?
Well, yes, I think that there is. I think that even more will be coming down the pike. I think one of the initial things which I wrote about actually early on in in President Trump's tenure is that when he put out his budget recommendations, he wanted to eliminate a number of the programs which research has shown are totally ineffective in achieving the purposes for which they were designed. And so I think that, even though those ended up not being passed by Congress, I think that shows you the type of thing that's going to be coming down the pike. The president, early on in his presidency, signed an executive order instructing Secretary DeVos to form a task force to review administrative regulations put out by the Education Department and to cut those that had no sense to them, that were counterproductive, and that prevented innovation and real learning in the classroom. And so I think that he gave a 300-day limit to that review, and so that should be coming out soon. I should mention that in addition to my book, A Corrupt Classroom, I have just also, because we can never stand still in the think tank business, I've also come out with a very new publication called An American Education Agenda, which makes 15 recommendations for reforming education in America, 5 for the federal government and 10 for state and local governments. And so, if you're interested in that publication, it's probably best for you to go onto our website at www.pacificresearch.org. That's Pacific Research, all one word, .org. And that is going to be released, actually, I believe, next week.
Well, that was a perfect segue. My first question was, do you have any information to see how schools have been changing? So you've kind of talked about that a little bit. That was one of our questions. Another question was, how did the movie end? Were there any consequences to Yvette Falora and her job as a teacher regarding her actions in the Trump riots?
Well, I actually checked on this before I came here today because I knew I was going to mention her, and I wanted to see if there were any developments. Now, she was charged last year on these rioting charges, and I believe that it's going to come to court. Actually, I believe next week. Actually, I believe the date I saw was January 18th, and I believe this is going to be up in Sacramento County. So I think we're going to see how this all turns out very soon.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting question. About exactly a year ago, we had a speaker who I think you knew. We have Vicki Alger talking
yes.
about school choice in Arizona. And the questioner wants to know, why are schools as bad in Arizona, if they are, I don't know, as California, if they have school choice? So if it's not a cure for everything.
Well, that's a very good question. I think that one of the things that we have to realize is, I'm not saying that school choice is a universal panacea for everything. You just look at the charter school movement. There are lots. California has about 1,000 or so charter schools, and they have different performances. Some of them follow pedagogies that are more successful than others. And so that's one of the things that parents have to be aware of. The other thing, though, is that I think for a choice system to really, if you look at the studies that have been done, the best studies, the ones where you have looking at a group of students who are what they call an experimental group, who go into some kind of choice program and go to private or charter schools, and then look at a comparison group of students who remain in the public system. Most of those studies show that the students who end up going to the choice schools end up performing better. So, I think that's the important thing to realize. Yes, there may be individual schools, whether they're charter or private, which may not do as well. But if you look at the broad grouping of schools that are involved in the choice movement, you find that overall, the students in those programs end up doing better. And so I think that's important. I think that what's also important is that you find that the improvement in performance doesn't just go one way. What you find is that when faced with more competition through a choice program, for example, the people in the public system feel that pressure, and then you can see that they're potentially going to lose their clientele, their customer base, and that they have to up their game. And so you also find that the public schools end up trying to actually do a better job because of the competition, which is really what competition is about. It depends. It depends on if they feel a big enough pressure by losing enough students. If you have just a boutique program, for example, that only pulls from a few students, from the district, it's a pinprick, right? And so therefore, the district may not feel as though that they need to really change. But if they're in danger of losing large groups of students because the program is more universal, for example, then that is one of the things that is a real push for the districts and the schools to improve their performance.
Well, here's a term I haven't heard in a while. I don't know about the rest of you. And understanding we still have a lot of cards to go through. What is or could you please discuss Common Core?
Well, one of my recommendations in my education agenda in the state and local area is to repeal and replace Common Core. I actually wrote a book back in 2012 about Common Core. In fact, that was a time when virtually no one outside of education insider circles had ever heard of Common Core. I wrote a book called Obama's Education Takeover. And it was put out by Encounter Books out of New York. And basically what it was an analysis of why Common Core was not all that it's cracked up to be. And not only from an academic point of view, but also from a control point of view. And so, like, if one of the things that I argued in that book and also elsewhere was that in California, one of the few things that we actually got right was that under Pete Wilson, we actually adopted a set of academic standards that actually were very good. In fact, they were so good that they were rated by organizations in Washington as one of the best in the country, along with standards like in Massachusetts. And so what happened when Common Core, which was a national set of education standards that came along with a lot of baggage that included an aligned set of curriculum and an aligned set of national tests. Okay, so you had this huge triangle, right? Standards, curriculum, and testing that came with Common Core. And when California decided to adopt Common Core and replace its previously really good state standards adopted under Governor Wilson, what they got was an inferior group of standards, which then led to an inferior curriculum and the aligned tests. In fact, some of you may know a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution named Bill Evers. Bill was also on the Trump Education Action Team for Education Policy with me. He was actually our team leader, but he's actually just written a really eye-opening article on the huge failure of the Common Core testing system. And that's really worth your while. Look under, and it just came out within the last week or so. But I think that, so what you find is that Common Core were our weaker standards, at least where California is concerned. It imposed a curriculum that was less rigorous than what we had under the old California standards. Algebra was required in the 8th grade. Under Common Core, it's required in the 9th grade. What happens when you only required it in the 9th grade? Well, guess what? You can't get to calculus by a senior in high school, right? And so therefore, how are you going to be ready for college, especially some of the more selective colleges, if you can't get to calculus by a senior in high school? So, you know, I think that it was an absolute travesty that we adopted Common Core for both academic and for political control reasons. Now we're told by all kinds of people that there's no way that we can touch Common Core, but there is a way. We can repeal it. We adopted it. We can repeal it. You know, there's nothing to stop California from saying we're going to go back to, you know, the pre-Common Core. President Trump, you know, campaign. What was one of the things he talked about during the campaign? He was against Common Core. There were two themes to the president's campaign on education. He was against Common Core and he was for school choice. And so, you know, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that the federal government can do about Common Core because all the Common Core is adopted by state boards of education, state legislatures, and it's up to the states to now do something about what they did. And, you know, and listen to all of you who have children or grandchildren who are now suffering under the pedagogies that are being imposed upon them in Common Core. And, you know, if we had more time, I have a whole speech about Common Core. And maybe you can invite me back, and I'll give that.
That's a good idea. That's a great idea. Okay, this next question is going to ask you to be a little bit of a part psychologist. What are your thoughts on the teacher-student biases based off their political views? Someone said now in the 9th grade and at a public school, and I feel that I cannot speak up. There's actually a series of questions, kind of breaks my heart, of parents or grandparents saying they're affected by this. What can they do? Your example said going to a teacher, principal, school board, or don't bring any fruit. Maybe there is no answer, but could you discuss what's left? What can people do?
Well, I mean, again, that's one of the reasons, one of the chief reasons why I say that. I mean, well, let me put it this way: is that yes, you can try and reform the education system. Okay, good luck with that. You know, good luck with that. You know, take for example, and I mentioned this in the book, I have a chapter on the sexualization of the classroom. And here in Cupertino, those of you who are from that town may know that there was a big controversy there about the sex ed materials that were being debated there. And a lot of parents thought that the materials were much too graphic for their middle school kids. And so eventually, because they pushed hard enough and made their presence known at school board meetings, etc., I think it was on a 2-2 vote, the district decided to pull back on those materials. Now, that's great, but what if they didn't? You know, what was left for those parents? Would they have to wait for the next school board election to elect people who would then support their views? That's great, and I'd recommend that. But their kids may be out of middle school by then, right? And they'd have to put up with this curriculum that they didn't agree with. And so I think that what people need is they need an escape ticket that allows them to get their kids out immediately. And if these school board members and district officials, want to say, we're not listening to you because, we've got other agendas that are more important than yours, even though you're the parents and your kids are the ones that we're supposed to be educating, then I think that, the parents need that opportunity to say sayonara.
This one deals a little bit more with the economics. Right now, over 60% of property taxes go to education. What can we do to make sure it gets spent appropriately? So outside of the bias, I'm sure there's a lot of waste. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's, yes, I think that, if you look at the way government operates, right, government, even when it tries to do the right thing, it often fails, right? So take, for example, Governor Brown's, his big achievement in K-12 education is something called the local control funding formula, all right? And what this program is supposed to do is to reduce strings from Sacramento on monies coming down to school districts. They're supposed to go to, kids in need, and one of the problems is that money, you think, okay, that's great, less red tape from Sacramento, right? And it's going down to the school districts, but it's going down to the school district. It goes to the district office, right? It doesn't go to the school, it doesn't go to your kid, right? It's not backpacked on your kid, right? It goes to the district, which gets to spend it on what? Things such as teacher union contracts, right? And there is a part of the local control funding formula that is called the local controlled accountability plan, right? And so the money that the districts receive are supposed to be accountable to all of you, right? As parents, as members of the public, as taxpayers, right? And the districts are supposed to implement activities that will make their use of that money more transparent and more, have all of you have an impact on how that money is spent. Have any of you heard about that? No? Surprise. In fact, you're probably with 100% of the rest of Californians who have never heard about that, who have never attended a school board meeting to talk about that, never knew that it was on a school district website, never knew any of that, right? So even though, yes, there is this thing called this local control accountability plan, there's no accountability because none of you who are supposed to be people holding the district officials accountable for how they spend the money know that it even exists, right? But if you had, as I say, and I hate to keep sounding like a broken record, if you had an escape ticket and said, hey, my kid is being lectured to by somebody who has a political viewpoint, who is impervious to a diverse discussion of political views, well, I'm going to take my kid out. I'm going to send him to someplace else where they do respect that. And that they'll know. That you know. You won't have to go to a school board meeting to talk about money from Sacramento going to which school, which pot, which whatever, and how is that affecting my kid in the classroom?
We'll make this the last question. Lance will be down at the book table afterwards. I'd like to meet you and have some books for you to read. You can hear about all these little things here. Then he's going to drive back up to Sacramento, so we'll get him on his way. The last question. Is there a school choice ballot, a measure on the ballot for California coming up? I don't follow that.
No, but certainly there are people who are interested in that. All I can tell you at this time is stay tuned.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah,
Ladies
yeah.
and gentlemen, Mr. Lance Izumi.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.